I spent my life creating a drug worth millions, one that could save thousands of lives. My children tried to steal it, but I was ready. I set the traps and they walked right into them. I was 63 years old when I realized that the best years of my life weren't behind me, but hidden in the quiet hours I spent among glass beakers, brass scales, and the low hum of refrigeration units in my private lab. You see, I was never one for vacations or shopping sprees. While other women my age might have been off collecting cruise brochures, I collected pipettes, centrifuges, and little glass vials with handwritten labels. Pharmacy wasn't just my profession, it was the marrow of my bones. I'd worked decades behind the counter of small-town drugstores, listening to mothers worry about their children's coughs, or old men whisper about aches they were too proud to name. I watched people fall through the cracks of medicine, too poor for proper treatment, too rare for the big pharmaceutical companies to care. That's when I decided that if no one else was going to bother, I would. So I built myself a lab. Not overnight, of course. Piece by piece, dollar by dollar. I bought an old storage building behind my house, one that used to hold farm equipment. My late husband thought I was crazy when I started cleaning it out, but I saw the potential in the dust and cobwebs. With a fresh coat of paint, second-hand equipment, and a stubborn streak as wide as the Mississippi, it slowly became my sanctuary. There in the quiet, I pursued the question that had haunted me for years. Could we make a drug affordable enough to save lives without bankrupting the patient? Not just another pill to dull symptoms, but something that struck at the root of one of the cruelest diseases of our time. I won't say which disease, not yet, darling, but trust me, it was the kind that didn't care whether you were young or old, rich or poor. After 20 years of experiments, failures, nights of staring at formulas until the ink blurred before my eyes, I finally did it. A drug formula unlike any other, simple, elegant, and powerful. I tested it, retested it, checked and cross-checked until I knew it was no accident. What I had in those pages wasn't just chemistry, it was hope. Hope written in symbols and equations. Now I'm no fool. In this world, hope like that has a price tag. I had it estimated once, through a contact who owed me a favor. $10 million. That's what they said it would fetch if I sold it to the right people. 10 million for the cure. 10 million for my life's work. But to me it was never about the money. Oh, it would have been nice, of course. But money disappears like sugar in hot coffee. This formula, this was my legacy. Something that would live on long after my hands grew too shaky to hold a pen. Still, I had to protect it. I'd seen too many stories of research stolen, names erased, families torn apart for less. So I locked it away. Not in a bank where strangers could meddle, but in a safe of my own choosing. A heavy steel box tucked in the corner of my lab, bolted to the concrete floor. I had it fitted with a double code and fingerprint lock. No one could open it without both. And the only fingerprint authorized was mine. Sometimes, in the still of the night, I'd walk out there with a cup of tea and lay my hand against the cool surface of that safe. It hummed faintly like a sleeping beast. Inside it lay years of my life. Every risk, every sleepless night, every prayer whispered when I thought I'd failed for good. I didn't tell my children. Emily and Thomas had their own busy lives, full of promotions and mortgages and soccer games. They loved me, I suppose, but they never understood me. To them, I was just Mom with her jars of herbs and her endless tinkering in the shed. What would they think if they knew I was sitting on something worth millions? I didn't want them to know. Not then. Not until I was gone and they were ready to understand that their mother hadn't wasted her life chasing some foolish dream. Until they were ready to see that science can be more than money, it can be a gift, a lifeline, a second chance. Looking back, maybe I should have trusted them with the truth earlier. Maybe it would have spared me heartache later. But at the time, secrecy felt like safety. You know, people think old age makes you soft. But if anything, it sharpens you. You see who really stands beside you, and who only lingers because they want something. At 63, I had already buried my husband, outlived a few friends, and said goodbye to too many patients. I thought I had learned every lesson there was about loss and betrayal. I hadn't. That safe sat like a silent promise in my lab, untouched except by me. I thought it would protect both my work and my family. But I didn't yet realize that the greatest danger wasn't in strangers coming to steal what I had built. It was in my own blood, in the voices that once called me Mom, in the hands I had cradled when they were babies. But that's for later. For now, just picture me there. 63 years old, a cup of tea cooling beside me, my hand steady as I turn the combination lock and hear the satisfying click. The formula safe inside, my secret safe with it. I thought I had built a fortress. I didn't yet know I had also built a stage. It started on a Tuesday afternoon, as ordinary as any other. I was in the kitchen stirring a pot of chicken soup when the phone rang. My hands smelled faintly of celery and thyme. I tucked the receiver between my shoulder and ear, wiping my palms on a dish towel. It was Richard, my old colleague from pharmacy school, now working at the FDA. He was the only person I'd ever trusted enough to share even a hint about my formula. We didn't speak often, but when we did, our conversations carried the weight of years. "Margaret," he said, his voice low, "do you realize what you're sitting on? 10 million is a conservative estimate. I'd say closer to $1 billion if the right company gets their hands on it." $1 billion. I remember my knees going weak, the spoon slipping from my fingers and clattering against the stove. I'd known it was valuable, yes, but not that much. I pressed my free hand flat against the counter, trying to steady myself. What I didn't realize was that I wasn't alone. My children, Emily and Thomas, were in the next room. I had thought they were out running errands, but no. They'd come back early, and the kitchen door stood slightly ajar. They must have heard every word. I hung up, shaken but strangely comforted too. Richard was right. The formula wasn't just valuable, it was world-changing. I told myself I'd keep his words locked in my heart. But later that evening, when I glanced into the living room, I saw something I hadn't seen before. My children whispering in low tones, heads bent close together like conspirators. At first, I told myself it was my imagination. They were siblings, after all. Families talk. But the glances they gave me, quick, sharp, assessing, were not the glances of children looking at their mother. They were the glances of investors measuring risk and reward. Emily came to me the next morning with a smile too polished to be genuine. "Mom," she said, "you've been working so hard all these years. Don't you think it's time you shared more of it with us? So we can help?" Her words were honeyed, but her eyes were hard. Thomas was no better. He dropped by unannounced that weekend, circling the lab like a hawk. "Impressive setup you've got here, Mom. Must have cost a fortune. Don't you ever worry someone might, take advantage of you?" I laughed it off, stirring sugar into his coffee, but my hands trembled. These were my children, the same ones I'd held through fevers, the same ones I'd driven to piano lessons and Little League. Now I could feel their greed like a draft sneaking under the door. I wanted to believe I was wrong. I wanted to believe that if I just stayed quiet, the storm would pass. But one evening, as I was locking up the lab, I caught a fragment of their conversation. Emily's voice, sharp and urgent. "If we wait until she's gone, we'll never get full control. We need to act now." Thomas's reply, "Don't worry. I've got someone in mind who can make it look legitimate. She'll never know what hit her." I stood there in the hallway, the keys cold in my hand. For a long moment I couldn't breathe. My children weren't just curious, they were plotting. I went to bed that night staring at the ceiling, listening to the old clock tick. Every beat was a reminder that the bond one thought unbreakable had cracked. I remembered when Emily was little, how she used to braid my hair while I studied for pharmacy exams. I remembered Thomas falling asleep in the back seat after baseball, his glove still tucked under his arm. Where had those children gone? What had I missed along the way? But grief had no place here. Not anymore. If my children were determined to come for the formula, then I would have to be just as determined to protect it. I didn't confront them. Not yet. Instead, I watched. I listened. I took note of every sidelong glance, every hushed phone call, every visit cut short. I knew something was coming and I would need to be ready. The safe in my lab, once a symbol of security, had become a magnet for danger. Emily and Thomas thought it held their golden ticket. They didn't realize that the safe could also be a trap. That night, I slipped into the lab with a manila folder in hand. Inside was a carefully prepared set of notes. A decoy, convincing enough to fool even a trained eye. I placed it inside the safe, closed the heavy door, and turned the lock until I heard that familiar click. As I stood there in the dim light, my reflection faint in the steel, I whispered aloud, "If it's a game you want, children, it's a game you'll get." The formula was still mine. And so was the truth. The knock on my door came on a Sunday morning. I remember because I was just taking a pie out of the oven, apple with a little nutmeg the way my mother used to make it. I don't normally entertain visitors on Sundays, but Emily and Thomas were standing on the porch, their smiles stiff as pressed linen. Between them stood a tall man in a tailored suit, briefcase in hand, looking more like he belonged in a courtroom than my living room. "Mom," Emily said brightly, "this is Mr. Harding. He's an investor who wants to talk with you about your research." Investor. The word tasted sour the moment she spoke it. I hadn't told them a thing about my formula beyond what they had overheard. Yet here they were, bringing strangers to my doorstep. My first instinct was to slam the door, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped aside, pie still steaming on the counter, and let the snake into my kitchen. We sat at the table I'd bought 40 years ago when their father was alive, the same table where little fingers once played with crayons and spilled milk. Now it was covered with contracts and legal papers, Mr. Harding smoothing them out like a magician laying down his deck of cards. "Mrs. Caldwell," he began, his voice smooth, practiced, "you've accomplished something extraordinary. But the pharmaceutical world is dangerous. Giants out there will stop at nothing to crush you, to take what you've built. That's where I come in. I represent a group of investors who specialize in protecting innovators like you." He slid a paper toward me. "If you sign this agreement, we'll assume guardianship of your formula. In exchange, you'll receive lifelong protection and a generous stipend. It ensures your work remains safe." I didn't touch the paper. My hands stayed folded in my lap, though my fingers itched to tear the whole pile in two. Guardianship. Stipend. Pretty words to cover what was really being offered. Theft wrapped in a ribbon. Emily leaned forward, her tone coaxing. "Mom, this is for your own good. You're not getting any younger. Don't you want peace of mind?" Peace of mind. As if my years of labor could be traded for a check and a pat on the head. As if I were some doddering fool ready to hand over the crown jewels for a bowl of soup. I looked at Thomas. He wouldn't meet my eye. He just tapped his pen against the table, eager for me to sign. "Mr. Harding," I said slowly, "tell me something. Why would investors with such deep pockets bother with an old woman's notes in a safe? Why not go straight to the pharmaceutical companies themselves?" He smiled, the kind of smile men give when they think you're naive. "Because your children care about you. They want to ensure you're protected. With us involved, you'll never have to worry again." That was the moment I knew. This man wasn't here for me. He was here because my children had brought him. They had arranged this entire performance, and he was merely their actor. I reached across the table, not for the papers but for the pie knife. I sliced into the apple pie, the scent of cinnamon filling the air. I served each of them a piece, sliding plates across the table one by one. "Eat," I said simply. They hesitated, surprised. Perhaps they thought I'd erupt in fury, or crumble into tears. Instead, I poured coffee into their cups with steady hands. If you truly care for me, you'll have no trouble sharing a meal before we talk business. They ate, though the pie must have tasted like ash in their mouths. I watched them carefully, the way I used to watch strangers at the pharmacy when they tried to slip in false prescriptions. Nervous eyes always gave them away. And oh, how nervous Emily and Thomas were. When the plates were nearly empty, I folded my hands again. Gentleman and lady, I'll consider your offer. But not today. You'll leave those papers here, and I'll have them reviewed by someone I trust. Emily started to protest, but I held up my hand. No more. I am not a fool, and I will not be rushed. Mr. Harding forced another smile, gathered his briefcase, and rose. Emily and Thomas followed suit, their faces pinched with frustration. At the door he turned back and said, "I'll be in touch, Mrs. Caldwell. But do think carefully. Time is not always on our side." When the door clicked shut, I stood in the silence of my kitchen, staring at the untouched contract. My children had tried to dress betrayal in Sunday clothes and pass it off as love. I carried the papers into my lab and set them on the counter, right beside the safe. I laid my hand on the cool steel once more, and I whispered, "Let's see how far they're willing to go." After that Sunday performance with Mr. Harding, I knew exactly what I had to do. My children had shown their hands too soon, and though it broke my heart, it also gave me the advantage. They believed the formula was locked inside my safe. Let them keep believing. What they didn't know was that weeks earlier, I had already made the most important decision of my life. I had placed the real formula, every page, every lab note, every precise measurement, into a sealed envelope and handed it to Richard. I remember the day well. His office smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper ink. I had pressed the packet into his hands, and he had looked at me with those steady eyes of his. "Are you certain, Margaret? Once I have this, it won't be only yours anymore." I had nodded. "I'd rather trust you, Richard, than risk it falling into the wrong hands. My children, they don't see the science. They see dollar signs." And so the real work was already safe, filed, copied, and protected, which left me free to play a different sort of game with Emily and Thomas. I spent a whole evening preparing the decoy. I pulled together fragments from old experiments, failed attempts, notes that led nowhere, formulas that looked legitimate on paper but would collapse under any serious testing. To the untrained eye, it looked like gold. To me, it was nothing more than dust swept into neat piles. I slid those papers into a thick folder, careful to make it look worn with use. I even smudged a little ink in the margins, made a few coffee rings on the covers. Authenticity is all in the details. Then, with deliberate care, I placed the folder into the safe. I turned the dial, pressed my finger to the scanner, and listened for the click. Standing there, I almost laughed. I had spent my life believing that safe was my shield. Now it was bait, shiny, irresistible bait. The next morning, Emily stopped by just to visit. She brought flowers of all things. Daffodils. Bright yellow, cheerful, and utterly out of place in her hands. She fussed around the kitchen, asking about my health, my meals, even whether the safe was working properly. "Funny you ask," I said, keeping my face calm as still water. "Yes, it's in good working order. I keep my most valuable things there." Her eyes flickered just for a second toward the lab door. Oh, she tried to hide it, but a mother knows. Later, Thomas came by too with a toolbox in hand. "Thought I'd check your locks, Mom. Can't be too careful, right?" He walked the perimeter of the house, rattling doorknobs, pretending to tighten hinges, but I knew what he was really doing. He was scouting, planning. That night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, the moonlight silvering the floor. My heart ached with a strange mix of sorrow and curiosity. These were my children, my babies once upon a time, and yet, here they were scheming like strangers. I could have confronted them. I could have shouted the truth into their faces. But I didn't, because I wanted to see. I needed to know just how far they would go. The days stretched on, quiet but tense, like the air before a storm. Emily called more often, asking about my schedule. Thomas kept forgetting things at my house, giving him an excuse to drop in unannounced. Each move they made tightened the knot in my chest, but it also confirmed my suspicion. They were circling the safe. One evening, as I was closing the curtains, I caught sight of Thomas outside, standing in the yard with his phone to his ear. He thought I couldn't see him, but I watched as he gestured toward the lab window, his voice low and urgent. I knew then the game was truly underway. The safe, once my fortress, had become the stage upon which my children would reveal themselves. Inside lay nothing of value, only the illusion of treasure. And outside my children plotted like moths circling a lamp, unaware the light would burn their wings. I pressed my hand against the glass, whispering to the night, "If this is what you want, then take it. But know this, it will cost you." And I waited. Because sometimes the best way to uncover the truth is to let the liars think they've won. The break-in happened on a Thursday night. Funny how ordinary the day had been before. Bright sun, a trip to the grocer's, me baking a lemon pound cake in the afternoon. Nothing about that day suggested it would end with the sound of my own safe being cracked open. I'd gone to bed early, a book resting open on my chest, my glasses sliding down my nose. Around midnight, I woke to a faint metallic clink. At first, I thought it was the old pipes rattling again, but then I heard another sound. A man's voice, low, urgent. My heart gave a sharp kick. I slid out of bed and crept down the hall, slippers silent on the worn floorboards. The glow from the lab spilled faintly into the dark, and as I pressed myself against the wall, I heard him, Thomas. My own son. "Careful," he whispered, his voice tight. "You said you could do this." Another voice answered, muffled but steady, the locksmith. I could hear the clicking of tools against the safe, the faint squeal of metal protesting. I held my breath, one hand gripping the doorframe. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I didn't step in. Not yet. I told myself I had to see how far they would go. If I burst in too soon, they'd only deny, only twist the story until I was the villain. No better to let them reveal themselves fully. The locksmith muttered something about the complexity of the lock. Thomas cursed under his breath. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the distinct traitorous click. The safe door swung open. "Got it," the locksmith said. Thomas exhaled like a man who just won a war. I could almost see the gleam in his eyes as he reached inside and pulled out the folder. He flipped it open, papers rustling. "This is it," he breathed. "We've done it. Done it." The words cut me to the bone. My son, who once clutched my hand crossing the street, now standing in my lab, stealing from me as though I were nothing more than an obstacle in his path. The locksmith asked for his payment, and Thomas handed him an envelope thick with bills. Then, with the folder clutched under his arm, Thomas hurried out. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving the lab in silence again. I stepped inside, the cool air wrapping around me. The safe door hung wide open, empty but for a few scraps I deliberately left behind. On the counter, the faint smell of their sweat lingered, mixed with the familiar sharpness of ethanol from my lab work. I should have been furious. Perhaps part of me was. But mostly I felt calm. Like a storm had broken at last. They had taken the bait. Hook, line, and sinker. I closed the safe door gently, spun the dial, and wiped the surface clean with a cloth. Then I stood there a long while, letting the truth settle in my bones. My children had crossed the line. No more whispers, no more suspicions. They had acted. They had stolen. And yet, what they carried away was nothing more than ashes dressed up as gold. I went back to bed that night surprisingly steady. I thought of the real formula, safe in Richard's hands. I thought of Emily and Thomas, clutching their prize, convinced they had finally beaten their old mother. I whispered into the darkness, "Let's see what you do now." The next morning Emily called me. Her voice was bright, almost too bright. "Hi, Mom. Just checking in. How are you today?" I smiled into the phone, though she couldn't see it. "I'm fine, dear. Just baking bread." "Oh, that's nice," she said. "Well, I'll let you go. Just wanted to hear your voice." She hung up too quickly, too eager to hide the triumph in her tone. I sat at the kitchen table, hands folded around my coffee mug, and thought of the game they were playing. They believed they had won, but what they didn't know was that the game had only just begun, and I had the winning card tucked safely away. You see, sweetheart, betrayal is a terrible thing, but it can also be a teacher. That night in my lab, I learned just how much my children were willing to risk for money. And I learned something else too, that I was stronger than I thought. Strong enough to face the storm they had set in motion. Because when you're betrayed by your own blood, you don't just defend yourself. You prepare to reveal the truth, no matter how painful it may be. And I was ready. I didn't have to wait long before the cracks began to show. Children who conspire together rarely stay united for long, especially when greed is involved. And my Emily, my firstborn, my headstrong girl, proved that to me in the most painful way. It was a week after the break-in. I'd gone about my days as if nothing had changed, baking, tending to my herb patch, even humming to myself as I worked in the lab. But beneath that calm surface I was watching, always watching. Emily came over one afternoon with a basket of muffins. Blueberries, still warm, though I could tell she hadn't baked them herself. She set them on the table, fussed over the kettle, and talked far too quickly, the way she always did when she had something to hide. "Mom," she said, "you'll never believe the opportunities out there. I met someone the other day, works for one of those big pharmaceutical firms. They're desperate for new research. They'll pay anything for a breakthrough." I kept my face neutral, stirring sugar into my tea. "Is that so?" "Oh yes," she went on. "Imagine, Mom, your work helping people all over the world. And of course we'd be compensated fairly. You wouldn't have to worry about bills or the house ever again." Her words were sugar-coated, but her eyes gave her away. She wasn't talking about legacy. She was talking about money, fast, easy, life-changing money. I nodded, sipped my tea, and said nothing more. Let her believe I was just a tired old woman who didn't see through her. But that evening I sat at my desk and wrote a note in my journal. Emily intends to sell the formula. Alone. And sure enough, a few days later I learned the truth. It was Richard who told me. He called late in the evening, his voice carrying both concern and the faintest trace of satisfaction, because of course the decoy had done its job. "Margaret," he said, "I've just received word from a contact. Emily approached a rival company with a portion of the research. They paid her a substantial sum up front. But when they tested the material..." He paused, letting the silence hang. "Yes," I prompted. "It was worthless. Incomplete. Inconsistent. Nothing but smoke. They know it's a forgery. And now their legal team is circling." I closed my eyes and pressed my hand to my forehead. My poor foolish child. She hadn't even waited to consult her brother. She had taken what she thought was gold and tried to sell it in the marketplace, not realizing it was no more valuable than sand. Richard's voice softened. "The company isn't letting it go quietly. There will be inquiries, maybe even lawsuits. If she doesn't tread carefully, she'll drag Thomas into it too." I thanked him and hung up, my tea long gone cold beside me. For a long while I sat in the dim light of the kitchen, listening to the old clock tick. My Emily. I thought of her as a little girl, building forts in the living room with every blanket she could find, her laughter ringing through the house. She used to say she'd be a teacher or maybe a nurse. She wanted to help people. Somewhere along the line, that bright-eyed girl had hardened into someone who saw the world only in terms of profit and loss. The next morning she called me, her voice high and tight. "Mom, I need to borrow some money. Just for a little while." Things are complicated right now. I almost laughed at the absurdity. She had just taken what she thought was worth millions, and here she was, begging her old mother for a loan. "I'm afraid I can't help you, Emily," I said gently, "but I'm sure things will sort themselves out." She went silent, then muttered something about being busy and hung up. I sat there a long while after, staring at the phone. Betrayal is one thing when it comes from enemies, but when it comes from the child you once rocked to sleep, the wound runs deeper than words can describe. And yet part of me felt a strange calm, because the truth was beginning to close in on them. The walls they had built from lies and greed were starting to crumble, and I hadn't lifted a finger. All I had done was wait. I poured myself another cup of tea, steadying my hands, and whispered to myself, "The storm has only just begun." Because Emily's rashness had set things in motion that neither she nor Thomas could stop. And soon, sweetheart, the world beyond our little family would take notice. There comes a point when a mother must stop waiting and start acting. For months I had sat quietly, letting Emily and Thomas play their dangerous little game. But when Emily's recklessness drew the attention of a major pharmaceutical company, I knew silence would no longer protect me, or my life's work. So one morning I put on my best coat, the navy wool one I usually saved for church, and I walked down to my study. I sat at my old oak desk, picked up the telephone, and dialed Richard's private line. He answered on the first ring. "Margaret," he said, his voice steady as ever. "I was hoping you'd call." "I think it's time," I told him. There was no need to explain further. He knew what I meant. Within the hour I was sitting across from him in a quiet corner of the FDA building, a folder thick with documents resting on the table between us. "These are the authentic records," I said, sliding the folder forward. Inside were the original patents, lab notes, and trial results, every shred of evidence proving the drug was real, and that it was mine. My hands trembled as I let go of the folder, like I was placing part of my very soul in his care. Richard opened it carefully, scanning the pages. His brow furrowed, then lifted slightly as he realized what he was holding. "Margaret," he whispered, "this is bigger than I imagined." "I know," I said. "And I also know my children are conspiring to steal it. They've already tried to sell a false version. If this continues unchecked, someone will get hurt. Maybe them, maybe me. I can't let it go on." Richard sat back in his chair, folding his hands. "Then we'll do this the right way. Quietly but thoroughly. I'll initiate an internal review, but off the record. Once we've confirmed everything, we can open an official investigation. That way, if your children try to claim ownership, we'll already have the evidence prepared." His calmness steadied me. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight lift slightly from my chest. "Thank you, Richard," I said. "I trust you." He nodded. "You were right to come to me. And Margaret," his eyes softened, "you've protected your work all these years. Now let me protect you." That evening back home, I walked through my lab slowly, running my hand across the familiar counters and glass jars. For so long this place had been my fortress, but now it had also become my children's battlefield. I locked the lab door and pocketed the key. The days that followed were quieter, but I could feel the undercurrents shifting. Emily called less often. Thomas grew more distant. When they did come around, their words were clipped, their smiles thin. I could tell something had unsettled them. Perhaps they were beginning to realize their formula wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. One evening, as I sipped tea by the window, I saw Emily pacing outside in the yard, her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice carried just enough through the night air. "It doesn't make sense," she hissed. "The company said it was fake. But it looked real. It had to be real." A pause, then, "No, I don't know what happened. Maybe she switched it somehow." I leaned back in my chair, letting her words wash over me. "Yes, my dear," I thought. "Maybe I did. Meanwhile, Richard updated me quietly. The FDA team had already begun reviewing my documents, confirming their validity. "We're moving carefully," he said. "But if your children push this into court or try another sale, we'll be ready. They'll trap themselves." I felt both pride and sorrow. Pride because my science had been validated by the highest authority. Sorrow because it had come to this, that my children's names would soon be tied to deceit and fraud. But I reminded myself of something my husband once told me, long ago when money was tight and we didn't know if the pharmacy would stay afloat. "Right is right, Margaret. Even if it costs you everything, you stand on it." Now, decades later, those words rang truer than ever. I poured myself another cup of tea, steadying my hands. The safe still sat in the corner of the lab, humming softly, holding nothing of value anymore. But in my mind it had already served its purpose. It had revealed the truth about my children, and it had bought me enough time to ensure the real work was protected. The storm was brewing, yes, but for the first time I felt ready to face it. Because this time I wasn't standing alone. The trouble didn't take long to find me. Greed has a way of rushing things along. It was Thomas who made the first move this time. I learned about it not from him, of course, but from a thick white envelope that arrived in my mailbox one rainy afternoon. Inside was a formal notice from the county courthouse. My children, my own flesh and blood, had filed a petition claiming they were the rightful heirs to my research. I sat at the kitchen table, the paper spread before me, raindrops ticking against the window pane. The words blurred for a moment as my eyes filled. Heirs. As if I were already dead. As if my life's work was nothing more than an inheritance to be squabbled over. When Emily called that evening, her voice was honey-sweet, almost mocking. "Mom, we didn't want it to come to this. But you're not well, and the courts will understand. You can't manage something so valuable on your own. It's better if Thomas and I take responsibility now." I bit down hard on my tongue to keep from shouting. Instead, I said softly, "Is that what you tell yourselves at night? That you're helping me?" She didn't answer. Just hung up. 2 weeks later, I found myself sitting in a courtroom that smelled faintly of old wood polish and ink. The ceiling fan ticked overhead, stirring the heavy summer air. Across the aisle, Emily and Thomas sat beside their lawyer, the same smooth-talking Mr. Harding who had once eaten pie at my kitchen table. He looked smug, as though the outcome was already decided. Their case was simple. They claimed to be the true heirs of my research, arguing that I was too old and fragile to manage it. They presented the decoy formula as evidence, waving the papers like a banner of victory. "This," Mr. Harding declared, "is groundbreaking science. But Mrs. Caldwell, at her advanced age, cannot reasonably be expected to carry it forward. Her children, however, are capable, willing, and already in possession of the research." I sat silently, hands folded in my lap. Let them speak. Let them dig their own grave. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, glanced over at me. "Mrs. Caldwell, do you have a response?" I rose slowly, every year of my age showing in the stiffness of my joints. "Your Honor," I said, "I respect this court. And I respect the truth. My children believe they hold the keys to my life's work. But science is not a family heirloom, to be passed like china or silver. It is built with sweat and sacrifice, tested and proven. If they truly believe they are the rightful heirs, then let the work speak for itself. Order an expert review. Put their evidence to the test." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Emily's face drained of color. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mr. Harding forced a smile, but I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. The judge nodded. "Very well. An independent review will be conducted by court-appointed experts. The hearing will resume once results are available." I sat down, my heart pounding but my face calm. This was the trap I had been waiting for. The formula they clutched so tightly was nothing more than a carefully woven web of half-truths and dead ends. When the experts pulled at its threads, it would unravel in their hands. Afterward, as we filed out of the courtroom, Emily brushed past me, her perfume sharp, her words sharper. "You think you're clever, don't you? But you won't win this." I turned to her, meeting her eyes with all the steadiness I could muster. "It's not about winning, Emily. It's about the truth. And the truth doesn't need my help to stand." She faltered then, just for a heartbeat, before storming off with Thomas at her side. That night I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea, the courthouse papers spread beside me. The house was quiet, but I felt no loneliness. Instead, I felt a deep, calm certainty. They had taken the bait. They had walked willingly into the very snare I had set. And soon, when the expert spoke, the world would know the truth. I whispered into the stillness, "Patience, Margaret. Patience." Because sometimes the sweetest justice isn't in striking first. It's in letting your enemies expose themselves, one desperate move at a time. The courtroom was full the day the experts returned. Reporters lingered on the steps outside, their pens eager. Their cameras hung around their necks like restless hounds waiting for the hunt to begin. I sat in my usual place on the right, hands folded neatly in my lap, as though I were in church waiting for the sermon. Across the aisle, Emily and Thomas sat stiff-backed, their lawyer whispering furiously in their ears. The judge entered, her gavel striking once. "We will now hear the results of the independent review." A man in a gray suit stepped forward, a stack of papers under his arm. He cleared his throat. "After thorough analysis, we must conclude that the formula presented by the petitioners is a forgery." The word landed like thunder. He continued, his voice precise and cool. "The data is incomplete, riddled with inconsistencies, and in several places, outright fabricated. It is not a viable pharmaceutical formula. Whoever created this either lacked the necessary expertise or deliberately intended to deceive." The murmurs in the room swelled. Emily's face flushed red, while Thomas gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Their lawyer tried to protest, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "Thank you," she said to the expert. Then her eyes turned toward my children, sharp as knives. "Do you wish to explain yourselves?" Emily opened her mouth, but no words came. Thomas muttered something about a misunderstanding, his voice cracking under the weight of the silence. And then came the final blow. The back doors opened and Richard walked in with a folder tucked under his arm. Calm, deliberate, he approached the bench and bowed his head respectfully. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to submit additional evidence." The judge nodded. "Proceed." He opened the folder and laid out photographs, transcripts, and recordings. His voice carried across the room, steady as a drumbeat. "These are messages and audio recordings exchanged between Emily Caldwell and Thomas Caldwell, discussing the attempted sale of what they believe to be their mother's research. In these communications, they acknowledge obtaining the formula by illicit means and actively conspiring to present themselves as the rightful heirs." He pressed a button on a small recorder. The courtroom filled with Emily's voice. "If we wait until she dies, we'll lose everything. We need to take it now." Then Thomas's voice. "Don't worry. I'll get us in. Once we have it, she'll never be able to prove it was hers alone." A ripple of shock spread through the room. Some gasped, others whispered. My children sat frozen, their faces pale as parchment. The judge leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "So not only is the formula a forgery, but you were actively plotting against your own mother?" Silence. She turned to me then. "Mrs. Caldwell, do you have the authentic research?" I rose slowly, my hand steady. "Yes, Your Honor. It has been in the care of the FDA for weeks, reviewed, authenticated, and protected. I never trusted it to that safe they broke into." Richard nodded, holding up a second folder, the real one. "This," he said, is Mrs. Caldwell's life's work. It has been verified by our experts at the FDA. It is both authentic and groundbreaking. The judge's gaze moved from the folder back to my children. Emily Caldwell. Thomas Caldwell. Do you have anything to say in your defense? But there was nothing left for them to say. They stared at the table defeated, their shoulders slumped under the weight of their own undoing. The judge's voice was cold and final. This court recognizes Margaret Caldwell as the sole inventor and rightful patent holder of the formula. Furthermore, evidence of conspiracy and fraud will be forwarded to the District Attorney's Office for criminal review. Her gavel struck once more, sharp and echoing. Court adjourned. I sat back down, my breath trembling in my chest. Not with fear, not even with triumph, but with something deeper, relief. The truth had finally spoken for itself. As the crowd filed out, Emily brushed past me, her eyes full of rage and shame. You ruined us, she hissed. I looked at her calmly. No, my dear. You ruined yourselves. Richard offered me his arm as we left the courthouse together. Outside, the sun was bright, the reporters calling my name, but I hardly heard them. I felt the air on my face warm and clean, as though a long storm had finally passed. For the first time in years, I could breathe freely. My work was safe. The truth was out, and the conspiracy that had tried to destroy me had collapsed under its own greed. The weeks after the trial felt like waking up from a long, heavy dream. For years I had lived with the weight of secrecy, guarding my work as though the world were waiting to snatch it from me. In the end, it hadn't been the world at all. It had been my own children. That wound will never fully heal. But life has a way of nudging us forward, even when our hearts are sore. The government approached me first. With Richard's guidance, I signed an agreement that would ensure the formula would be developed safely and distributed fairly. The contract was worth more money than I had ever imagined. Hundreds of millions, they told me, perhaps billions once production began. But more important than the numbers was the clause I insisted on. The drug would be accessible, not buried behind impossible price tags. It would save lives, not just fill bank accounts. For the first time, I felt my work had truly found its place in the world. Not hidden in a safe, not dangled as bait for the greedy, but alive, ready to help people, the way I had always dreamed. As for Emily and Thomas, well, the law had its say. Fraud is a heavy word and it clings like tar. They lost their case, their reputations, and most of their standing in the community. More than that, they faced charges for conspiracy and attempted theft. Watching them in handcuffs, I didn't feel triumph. I felt sorrow. I had given them everything I could as a mother, my time, my care, my love. But I could not give them the one thing they wanted most, the fruit of my life's labor, unearned. One quiet morning, I walked into my lab alone. The safe still sat in the corner, its surface cool and blank. I pressed my hand against it, remembering all the nights I thought it would protect me. In truth, it had only been a mirror showing me the faces of those I could trust, and those I could not. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat at my old wooden desk. The sun spilled through the window, catching the glass vials on the shelf, turning them into jewels. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the gnawing fear that someone might come for me. My work was safe now, beyond the reach of greed. Later, when the reporters asked me to sum up the whole ordeal, I gave them the only words that felt true. I put my faith in science, not in your greed. And science made things right. And with that, sweetheart, I closed the chapter, not just on the formula, but on the years of secrecy, fear, and betrayal. What remains is the quiet triumph of knowing that something I built with my own hands will outlive me. And maybe, just maybe, that's the truest kind of legacy. My dears, if in this story you saw yourselves, be sure to write about it in the comments. I would be very interested to read it. Thank you.